Jeffrey Rosen is not only a law professor at George Washington University, his academic background is staggering. More important, he is the chief executive officer of the National Constitution Center. He does a whole lot of other things. I'm not going to go into all of what they are. You're going to listen to him, and here's a person who has studied the founders of the Constitution, and he makes reference frequently to the people whose names we all know: Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, and how they came to put the Constitution together. And there's all sorts of wonderful themes through this book, but I assure you, and I honestly believe as I read this book, I feel a part of it, that the pursuit of happiness can truly, truly be filled with public service. Jeffrey Rosen, we welcome you. We're glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's wonderful to be introduced by you and your wonderful family. Adam is related to Brad Snyder, who just wrote a great biography of Felix Frankfurter, and his son Ryan is amazing, and it's a family of public service, so I'm really honored to be introduced by you.
I'm impressed by who you are and what you've done.
Wonderful. Friends, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome. And I'm so excited to talk to you about my adventure during COVID, reading the books that inspired the founders' understanding of the pursuit of happiness. And I want to tell you about how this journey changed my understanding of how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen. And what I learned was that for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And by virtue, they meant self-mastery, self-reliance, character improvement, self-improvement, using every moment of the day to be your best self, to still and calm your unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, so you could achieve the calm tranquility that allows you to tune in and to achieve your potential and think of others. It was a transformative experience. It changed the way I thought about the founding. It changed the way I live every day. And let me tell you about how it happened. So it was at the beginning of COVID, and I was rereading the part of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography where he says that in his 20s, he set out to achieve moral perfection. He was just starting off as a printer in Philadelphia, and he made a list of 12 daily virtues that he later expanded to 13. And they included industry, order, tranquility, silence, resolution. And he saved the one he found hardest for last, which was humility. A Quaker friend told him he needed to work on that. And he made a list of these virtues, and then he had a grid with the days of the week on the x-axis. And every week he resolved to focus on a different virtue and to put an X mark next to the one where he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it was very depressing because there were all these X marks every day. And he gave up, but he thought he was a better person for having tried. Now, I knew about this system because a few years ago, my rabbi in Washington, D.C., recommended that a friend and I try the Hebrew version of Ben Franklin's Virtue Project. It's called Musar, or character improvement. That's the Hebrew word for character. And this Hasidic rabbi in 1808 who admired Franklin translated the system into Hebrew, and it's still practiced today by Hebrew seekers. We didn't even know it came from Franklin, but we tried it for a while. Every week we focused on a different virtue. We put an X mark where we fell short. We've also found it incredibly depressing. Tranquility. Every time you lose your temper, you have to put an X mark, and it's very, very hard to achieve. But we thought we were better for having tried. So I knew the system. But what I noticed during COVID is that Franklin chose for his motto a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And the motto for his project was, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." Okay, so I registered that. A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the UVA campus. In the room of the Boar's Head was a list I'd never seen before of 12 virtues that Thomas Jefferson had drafted for his granddaughters. And what was striking about this is they were almost identical to Franklin's. It was things like resolution, do what you ought and resolve to do what you should. Silence, when angry, count to 10. When very angry, count to 100. There's one of the Franklin 12 virtues that Jefferson left off his list, and that was chastity. But what really struck me by seeing the Jefferson list, in addition to the fact that it looked so much like Franklin's, was that Jefferson also chose as his motto this book by Cicero that I hadn't heard of, the Tusculan Disputations. And when Jefferson was old and people would write to him and ask, what's the secret of happiness? He would send this passage from Cicero, which says, "He who has achieved tranquility of soul, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the wise man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man." So I thought, I've got to read the Cicero book because it was so important for both Franklin and Jefferson for understanding happiness as virtue. But what else to read? Then I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send to kids who were going to law school or people who asked him when he was old, how should I be educated? And this reading list is striking, first of all, for the rigor of the schedule that Jefferson prescribes in following it. He said you have to get up every morning before dawn, read moral philosophy before dawn, watch the sunrise, then read political philosophy and history until lunch, and in the afternoon astronomy and the natural sciences, and then after dinner some Shakespeare and poetry is allowed, and then to bed, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, a very serious reading schedule. My eye was drawn to the section that he called alternatively moral philosophy or natural religion or ethics. And at the top of this list of 10 books was that Cicero book, the Tusculan Disputations, and then other books by classical Greek and Roman moral philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, and then some Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Hutcheson, Bolingbroke, David Hume. What struck me about this list is that I hadn't read most of the books, and I've had a marvelous liberal arts education. I studied, I was an English major in college, history, political philosophy, political science and law with great teachers at great universities, but I just never encountered these classical books of moral philosophy before, and I thought I should read them just to fill this gap in my education. So it was COVID, we all had a little more time, so I decided to follow Jefferson's schedule. Got up every morning before sunrise, read for an hour or two, watched the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I'd read, which is a habit I know that sounds very weird, and I hadn't done it before. My wife Lauren is here, and she's a poet, and she'd inspired me to write poetry before, but never sort of summed up ancient Greek wisdom in the sonnet form, but it just seemed like a way of crystallizing the daily learning. And then I learned, to my surprise, that lots of people in the founding eras wrote sonnets to sum up the classical wisdom, including, most significantly, Phyllis Wheatley, the first black poet who wrote these brilliant poems of virtue that were acclaimed throughout the world, and then Alexander Hamilton and Mercy Otis Warren and John Quincy Adams, who would wake up in the White House as president, read Cicero, particularly the Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book, and write sonnets and watch the sunrise. So there's something in this marvelous wisdom that just inspires people to try to sum it up. And that's what I did. I spent a year reading these wonderful books, and it transformed my understanding of happiness. And as I said, it for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. In particular, though, there's a antithesis that appears in all of the moral philosophy between reason and passion. Over and over again, the founders say we should use our powers of reason to master or moderate our unproductive passions or emotions so we can achieve the calm tranquility that defines well-being and happiness. This distinction comes from Pythagoras, of all people. Who knew that Pythagoras, in addition to being the inventor of the triangle, of course, and then the harmonic system of triads and fifths and all the beautiful harmonies of the universe, also lived on the Isle of Croton as a guru, and he encouraged his disciples to first be good and then like gods, and he recommends rigorous vegetarianism and moderation in all things, in eating and drink. And he recommends this system of daily self-accounting that inspired Franklin, and says every night before bed you should make a list of your where you've fallen short. And in particular, it was Pythagoras who introduced this distinction between reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and suggests that we should use our reason to moderate or modulate our unproductive desires and emotions so we can achieve calm tranquility. Plato popularizes this in his famous metaphor of the charioteer, with the charioteer representing reason with a noble and appetitive horse in front of him, and we have to use our reason to ensure that all three emotions are in harmony. And this is also a way of distilling Aristotle's famous definition of happiness in the Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle says that happiness is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. That's the famous definition. And the terms virtue and excellence aren't self-defining, so it's not intuitively obvious what that means until you see Aristotle's chart of the golden mean. And he says every passion or emotion has an excess or a deficiency, and by using reason we can achieve the moderate middle. So not undue exuberance or undue despondence, but calm tranquility is the goal. It's really an exercise in psychology. Today we call it emotional intelligence, using reason to interact productively with others. They're not saying that we should avoid emotion or be passionless, but just to avoid unproductive emotions so that we can tune in and be effective. As it happens, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's mom gave her the same advice. I had the honor of writing a book with her, collecting our conversations over the years. It was called Conversations with RBG. She said that her mom told her, overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will not serve you, and you have to always maintain your focus for productive work. And her mom got it from the ancient Stoics. And this is the core definition of happiness for most of human history. It's essentially a version of the marshmallow test. Remember at Stanford years ago, kids are given one marshmallow if they want it immediately. If they can wait for 15 minutes, they get two. The kids who could wait just do much better in later life. They have impulse control. They can engage in long-term thinking. And all of the moral philosophy, in different ways, is essentially talking about that need for sober second thoughts, for reflecting about whether or not this is really in your best interest, not for having the second marshmallow or the third muffin right away, but trying to achieve a balance so that you can maintain productivity throughout the day. That's the core of it. And it's just, here's what was so exciting about this reading. First of all, it just blows my mind that I was able to write this whole book at home sitting on the couch, because all of the books of the world are now online. It's just a remarkable world that we're living in. And then with word searches, you can look for whatever you like. And I searched all those books on Jefferson's reading list, and almost all contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And almost all define happiness as virtue, not pleasure. I also was able to answer this question that people have long asked about, why didn't Jefferson say life, liberty, and property? Remember, John Locke's second treatise on government talks about the fact that we're all born with natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And most folks have assumed that Jefferson was using happiness as a synonym for property. He wasn't. It was a technical choice. And that's because happiness, unlike property, is an unalienable right. Here's the technicality of natural rights theory. We're all born in a state of nature. We move to form governments and surrender or alienate to government certain rights in order to secure greater safety of the rights we've retained. Property is obviously an alienable right. I have to be able to alienate property, to sell stuff, and also give government the power to regulate property so I can enforce contracts. By contrast, happiness is unalienable because it's rooted in reason. And Jefferson's greatest achievement, which he puts on his tombstone, 3 achievements: founding UVA, the Declaration, and then the Virginia Declaration of Religious Freedom. And in the Virginia Declaration, he says immortally that the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by other men. In other words, I can't order you to think as I please or as you please. Your thoughts are the product of your reason, and you can't alienate or surrender your capacity to reason. It's inherent in who you are as a human being. And because the pursuit of happiness is essentially living according to reason. That's the whole Stoic wisdom, aligning yourself with the divine harmonies of the universe. Happiness, like reason, is unalienable, as conscience is unalienable. And that's why Jefferson is not engaging in some esoteric philosophy. This phrase, the pursuit of happiness, is literally everywhere. It's in all these books. Christian, Stoic, Whig, Revolutionary, Blackstone's Law Dictionary, and all defined in precisely the same way. So that's why it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not property, and that's why happiness is virtue. And then I was able to see this exciting new connection, crucial connection, between personal self-government and political self-government. George Washington, in his farewell address, says that without virtue, the republic will collapse because we'll succumb to demagogues and the mob. Caesar on horseback will come and flatter the people who will exchange their liberty in exchange for cheap luxury. Only if citizens can find the same balance in the constitution of the state that we achieve in the constitution of our minds will the republic survive. And that's why I reread the Federalist Papers in a new light. Madison in the Federalist Papers is constantly talking about how it's a manual for public happiness. And Madison and Hamilton are really concerned about demagogues. They've just seen Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts with farmers who can't pay their debts mobbing the federal courthouses. And Madison famously defines a faction as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. There's that reason-passion distinction that they're talking about we have to achieve in our own constitutions. And that is why Madison says in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. The whole Constitution is designed to slow down deliberation, to prevent mobs from forming, and to ensure that reason rather than passion will prevail. And that's why they believe that personal virtue was necessary for public virtue, and that unless individual citizens could master their tempers, not tweet their angriest self or just constantly be trying to own the libs or own the conservatives, but achieve balance, moderation, all the virtues that are on Franklin's list, then we're going to elect demagogues rather than wise leaders, and also not be able to listen to different points of view. So it's very significant for me to see these connections and to understand the American idea in a new light. So most of the book is an attempt to ask, how did the founders apply this in their own lives? They're talking about the importance of virtue. How did they live up to it? Well, let me tell you about some of what I learned. The first thing is that they talk constantly about this. They're always, we'd call it journaling. They're writing in their diaries about their anxieties, they're falling short, they're eating too much, they're drinking too much, they're not achieving their potential, they're wasting too much time staring in front of the fire rather than, engaging in their virtuous reading. John and Abigail Adams are my first chapter. They're such a wonderful couple because their entire courtship is conducted in terms of classical moral philosophy. Inspired by Pythagoras, they decide to make a list of each other's faults, which is a dangerous thing to do when you're dating. Not a great idea, but they make their list, and Abigail is very flattering to John. She said, well, your fault is you're so intellectually intimidating. Some people might find you a little austere. And he says, well, your faults are you're not practicing the piano enough, you're not reading enough, and you're pigeon-toed. And she says, well, I'll try to practice the piano more, but a gentleman should never comment on a lady's posture. But they have this beautiful intellectual friendship, and they're challenging each other to master their passions. And Adams's main thing he has to work on is humility, because he's the most famously arrogant man of his age. This musical 1776, I'm obnoxious and disliked, that cannot be denied. He's always raging against the rest of the world for not recognizing his talents. He says that Adams wrote the Declaration of Independence, but Franklin is getting all the credit. He speaks of himself in the third person, of course. He's mocked as his rotundity. He wants the president to be addressed as his elective majesty. And Franklin calls him always an honest man, certainly good, but a little mad, just because of his, self-regard. And he has these great fallings out and reconciliations with two people who I write about, Mercy Otis Warren and Jefferson. Mercy Otis Warren is such an inspiring character. She's classically educated with her brother, James. He gets to go to Harvard, as the guys do. Women have to be educated at home in those times. But when you're given a great education, as Mercy Otis Warren did, she becomes what John Adams calls the poetical genius of the Revolution. She writes these satires of the British that are classically infused about the Boston Tea Party. She is a best-selling author. And then she falls out with Adams over politics. She writes a multi-volume history of America from an anti-federalist or Jeffersonian points of view. She accuses Adams of being self-regarding and obnoxious. He says, I'm not self-regarding. Who would ever suggest it? They have this huge fight. And but the beautiful thing is they reconcile, and he calms down, and Abigail sends a lock of her hair in friendship. And at the end of their days, Mercy says, I just have one favor to ask you. You're the only guy who knows that I wrote this play that you said was the best play in the Revolution, but some guy has taken credit for it and put his name for it. Put his name on the title page. Can you certify I wrote it? And Adams said, you're the only genius who could have written this great play. Gets on his horse, rides into Boston, goes to the Athenaeum, and writes on the title page, this was written by Mercy Otis Warren. You can see that pamphlet in the Athenaeum today. A beautiful sign of his ultimate capacity for friendship. And then there's the reconciliation with Jefferson. And among the most moving letters in all of American history are the Adams-Jefferson letters. They're old. They fought a revolution together. They fell out in the bloodiest political election of all time, which almost brought the Republic to its knees. They formed the first political parties, and then they reconcile. What do they want to talk about? Comparative spirituality and the meaning of happiness. And it's so exciting for Adams when he discovers that Pythagoras, the founder of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas. And Adams is convinced that once this is confirmed, it will show the connection between Eastern and Western moral philosophy, which Adams sums up in the axiom, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. Gandhi summed this up from the Bhagavad Gita as renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external results and enjoy eternal bliss. And Adams sees that connection between the Stoic dichotomy of control and the Christian commandment to love thy neighbor and to be perfect even as Jesus is perfect. But he's just concerned, did Joseph Priestley, who's writing a comparative piece on the morals of the Hindus and the Christians, live long enough to complete it? Jefferson said he did. It's just been published in Paris. I'll send you the edition. And Adams is so excited. And he sums up his mature spirituality, just the degree to which they were eager to get access to books and that they're actually reading and growing at that age is so moving. And Jefferson confesses at the end of his long life, he is now an Epicurean. He started off as a Stoic. When his dad died, he copied that passage from the Tusculan Disputations into his diary. But after a lifetime of reflection, he's an Epicurean. And that doesn't mean he stresses heedless pleasure-seeking. That's a libel on the Epicureans by the Stoics. Instead, the Epicureans argue that we should rationally contract our desires so that we can meet them. Essentially, the Stoics say we have to happiness is the absence of pain, and that pleasure is not at all relevant. And the Epicurean said that's unrealistic, that you should just experience no pain and no grief. Instead, they say happiness is pleasure, but it has to be rational pleasure so that you're not heedlessly seeking excess, but can moderately meet your desires. And that's what Jefferson says he is at the end of his life. Just very inspiring in their deep spirituality, their ecumenicalism, and the fact that they're still reading and growing at that age. Now, what about Jefferson and slavery? How could it be that this man who insists that happiness is virtue and that all men are created equal be an enslaver? And what I learned through the lens of moral philosophy is that Jefferson and the other enslavers of that generation didn't even try to justify it. There's this really remarkable quotation from Patrick Henry. He's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, quoting from Cato's letters. And Henry says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." That's what it was. They knew it was wrong, but they liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. They knew it was wrong, did not try to justify it, but just didn't want to give up the lifestyle. And that moment of truth, of recognition of their own hypocrisy, was shared by many of them in moments of candor. Jefferson himself, unfortunately, becomes even worse on close examination because of the degree of his self-rationalization and the degree of his racism. His rationalization included living like a Roman emperor rather than a Stoic philosopher at Monticello, where he's constantly, going on these shopping sprees in Paris and buying these fancy furniture, and then surrounds himself at Monticello by his own kids, by Sally Hemings. They're the ones who are serving him right in his house. Madison and Eston, and Sally Hemings agrees to come back from Paris with Jefferson on the condition that he free their kids when he dies. He keeps that promise, frees no one else aside from his own kids or their relatives, 7 people. Everyone else is sold on his death because he can't pay his debts. His whole rationalization had been, I don't want to pass debts along to my daughters. His entire enslaved population is sold. Parents are separated from kids, and all of his industry and frugality and all those virtues are just exposed as a lie. The other shocking thing is the degree of his racism. In the Notes on the State of Virginia, he has this chilling passage denouncing Phyllis Wheatley, the first great black poet. He says her poetry is beneath contempt because his suspicion, he says it's just a suspicion, is that black people are intellectually inferior. And he says, unlike Roman poets who were white and enslaved, Terence, the Roman poet, wrote good poetry. Wheatley's is beneath contempt because she's black. It's shocking. And what's striking is other founders didn't share that racism. Phyllis Wheatley sent her poems to George Washington, who acclaimed her genius. And she became what Professor Henry Louis Gates calls the Oprah of her day. She was an international celebrity because her poems were so great. Her story is amazing. She comes over from enslaved, in chains. Her mistress and master, for some reason, decide to let her be educated along with their kids in their schoolroom. She reads the classical moral philosophy of the classical poets, Cicero and Seneca, writes these poems of virtue, acclaiming the virtue of the revolution, denouncing slavery. She sends her poems to George Washington. He acclaims them. But then the city of Boston decides, well, how do we know she wrote her own poems? So they hold a trial. In this extraordinary setup, the trial of Phyllis Wheatley, John Hancock, the guy who wrote the Declaration, along with Cotton Mather and the other Boston worthies, examined Phyllis Wheatley to see whether or not she wrote her own poems. And they ask her about, who was Apollo and name the 9 muses. She passes with flying colors. They attest that she wrote her own poems. And then she goes to London. She meets the Duke. She's acclaimed by London society. And she becomes a real celebrity because her poems are so great. So it's a striking story, both of the power of the classical education, of her genius, and of the fact that Jefferson was unusual in refusing to recognize a great poetic genius that was acclaimed the world over. I mentioned Washington. By contrast to Jefferson, he seems even larger rather than smaller on close examination. And his greatness is his self-mastery. He had a hot temper, which Ron Chernow, his biographer, thinks may have come from his mom, who's always nagging him, and he's always trying to, keep himself under control. But he achieves superbly, and he reads Seneca on time. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be, says Seneca, in the famous phrase quoted by Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And Washington is always having all of his meals and his appointments on time. There are clocks everywhere at Mount Vernon. And in one of his greatest moments, he's at Newburgh, and the soldiers are going to rebel because they can't be paid in currency. Congress won't pay them. And it looks like they're going to try to have a coup. And Washington mounts this wooden platform called the Temple of Virtue, and he reads from his favorite classical play, Addison's Cato, which talks about the consoling pleasures of mild philosophy. He has that performed for the troops to calm them down. And then he appeals for their virtue and temperance and patience and says, if you can just, be patient, then I'll ensure you get paid. And he takes out his reading glasses, and he puts on his reading glasses, and the soldiers have never seen him. confessed weakness before. He says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep because they've never seen him confess weakness. But they heed his call for patience. They stop the mutiny, and they're eventually paid by Congress. And it's that self-mastery that makes him the presiding, most important figure at the Constitutional Convention, where he doesn't say very much. It's just the calm presence of his self-mastered stature that ensures the delegates are able to reach compromise, and then leads to him to be so successful and respected as president. And that's at the core of his farewell address, where he's calling for virtue. Let me end with two more great characters, John Quincy Adams and Frederick Douglass, who are so significant because they show that this philosophy of happiness as self-mastery is carried beyond the founding era all the way to today. If I had to pick a single figure in this book who is a hero, I think it would be John Quincy Adams, because he exemplifies the mindful life of virtuous self-mastery in such an inspiring way. He is hit over the head with the need to be self-mastered by his mom and dad, Abigail and John Adams. And I thought that having a Jewish mom was tough. I'm glad I didn't have a Puritan mom, because Abigail is very tough on John Quincy Adams. She's constantly saying, "Master your passions, use your reason. Remember the proverb, he who is slow to anger is greater than he who takes a village." And, you know, he's in Paris and he's looking at women for the first time, and she resists temptation. And he takes from this, he's an almost neurotic focus on his own shortcomings and the constant sense he's not living up to his potential. There's this amazing letter that he writes in his diary, which is among the greatest diaries of any American president and totally worth reading. I'm 31 years old. He's just turned down a U.S. Supreme Court appointment. He's minister to Russia, and he says, "I'm 31 years old and I haven't achieved anything. I'm not living up to my potential. I'm spending too much time in the taverns. I'm drinking too much. I'm going to the theater, and I should be." He said, "If only I could find more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery." He set a very high bar for himself. He goes on to become, while he's serving in the Senate, the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric at Harvard, where he writes the definitive text on Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book and is like a sort of golden thread throughout this whole journey. He becomes elected President of the United States, the first son to succeed a father, and then tragedy strikes. His oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. The kid can't take the pressure of being called George Washington, and also the fact that his father is always telling him, "Be perfect." He writes these letters from a Christian father based on his own close Bible readings, and he's constantly telling the son to be perfect. And the kid becomes an alcoholic and jumps off a steamship. And Adams is crushed. He doesn't know how he can continue. What does he do to find solace? He spends a year rereading the Cicero, and in the original, and he writes these beautiful poems about it. And based on this year of reflection, he resolves to become the greatest abolitionist of his time. And having not previously really opposed slavery, he introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. He denounces the gag rule in Congress, which forbids the reading of abolitionist petitions. And he has this incredible death where he has a stroke on the floor of the House after voting against the Mexican War. And his last words are, "I am composed," which he gets from Cicero. It's the model of the perfectly composed man in that phrase that Jefferson used to hand out that represents the calm tranquility that defines happiness. It's just blows your mind. We'll have some questions now. Let me just end with the extraordinary story of Frederick Douglass. If there's a takeaway for this project for me, it's the transformative power of deep reading. And I had really gotten out of the habit of reading for stuff that wasn't related to deadlines or whatever I was supposed to be doing at work. And this unusual practice during COVID, which goodness knows how I was led to it, of just waking up every morning and reading for 2 hours a day, really changed my life. So since then, and it's such an antidote to social media. And it's true that social media is James Madison's nightmare and the kind of enraged to engage in tweeting ourselves to death and is the opposite of the kind of calm deliberation that Madison had in mind. And Madison also is very keen on the new technology of the broadside press, which he thinks will slowly diffuse reason across the land when citizens read complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers and discuss it with their representatives and kind of perform the duties of citizenship. And that's obviously the very distant from the age of Instagram and X or whatever it's called. But if there's a silver lining to all this, it's, as I said, the fact that all the books in the world are free and online. And it just blows my mind that I could read all these books on Kindle or read the actual originals that the founders themselves read, because everything is digitized. And when I was a kid, I went to the Library of Congress and was so filled with wonder at the thought that all the books in the world were in that place. The Jefferson Building, I still think, is the most beautiful in D.C. They're now right on my phone. And I was so inspired. If Adams and Jefferson, as old men, could look for books, then I can too. All I need is the self-discipline to read them. And I developed this rule that when I wake up in the morning now, I still read on the phone, but I have to actually read books rather than browsing blogs before I'm allowed to check email or something else. And the small amount of self-discipline it takes to swipe left to the book rather than right to the blog allows, it's just a new habit. It's a practice that is very transformative. And what inspires me about this habit is how much people sacrificed for this kind of reading, and that's why I want to close with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, the moment that he finds most crushing is not only when he's enslaved, but when his wicked master forbids him from being taught how to read. He feels like they're trying to control his mind. What does he do? He goes onto the streets of Baltimore. He buys reading lessons with bread. He pays boys to teach him how to read. And then he buys with bread this golden book, The Columbian Orator. And this book, which is the best-selling textbook of its time, has excerpts from the classical moral philosophy, from Cicero, from Seneca, from Ben Franklin. It has a dialogue against slavery that convinces Douglass to become the greatest freedom fighter of his day. And this book, which he buys with bread, for goodness sake, changes his life and changes the world. And for goodness sake, if Frederick Douglass the sacrifices that he made to find access to books and then to live them, and the heroic sacrifices that so many made to have the power to read, inspires me to try to make the best of our opportunities to read too in this wonderful world where it's so easy to have access to books and all we need is the discipline to read them. So that's how I spent my COVID vacation. That's what the book is about, and I would love to hear your questions. Thank you so much.
Take this from you, if you could use that, I guess. So, questions? There we go. I can't get through here. Excuse me. Please speak into the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. From some of the things you said, it kind of reminds me of the saying from Ghana that the ruin of a nation starts in the homes of its people. And a couple of questions I had for you. You were discussing pursuit of virtue and what's the word? Delayed gratification. And delayed gratification has been taught to children for generations. However, my question to you is, what of the situation where delayed gratification works when you can predict the future, when you know the outcome of the future? But what if there's times that are volatile, unpredictable, competitive, complex, and ambiguous, where the future that the elders think is going to happen, it doesn't happen? And related to that, also talking about virtue, is what happens, in a kind of related question, what is your take on the idea of something that might have been considered virtuous in an earlier generation and helps you be effective in life in an earlier generation when it stops being effective? Now, I've heard some say you should still pursue a lot of those virtues because no matter what the cost, because we should value them as their own reward, even if we die as a result of them. And there are scenarios where people have been martyred. They consider it its own reward. But What's your take on both those two related scenarios? Thank you.
It's very powerful questions. I love that quotation from Ghana. The ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people. Lauren, my wife, is a anthropologist who specializes in Ghana, and would love to explore the connections between that and the Western and Stoic philosophy. But the Stoic philosophy is not just valid when we can predict the future. It's especially powerful during times of uncertainty when we can't. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, is writing during a smallpox epidemic when there are huge wars and destruction. And by the way, if you want a sort of ancient book to start with Marcus Aurelius, because he's the most accessible. He's saying during these times of uncertainty, let's focus on the only thing we can control, which is our own thoughts and emotions, because this will allow us to deal with any event, no matter how shocking or unexpected or tragic. In its extreme form, the Stoics say even the death of loved ones should not discomfit or throw us off our path, because we can be grateful for the good times we shared and recognize that things are as they are supposed to be. Whatever is right. And therefore, by living in the moment and just focusing on our reaction to events rather than trying to control those events, it is good in times of uncertainty as well. So delayed gratification doesn't mean let's save up for the future financially. It means not reacting in anger or impulsively immediately, and just thinking how rationally can I control my own reaction to things so that I can continue to thrive even in the face of adversity. That's one thought. And as for virtues becoming obsolete, there's no doubt that what one generation perceives as virtuous may seem like the greatest wickedness of another. Slavery is the most obvious example. But what is the example for us? What's our analog for the lifestyle that we know is wrong but just don't want to give up? And the obvious one is climate change. I mean, I know that it's wrong for me to be flying in these airplanes and driving, and the costs will be imposed on my kids, but I like the lifestyle and just don't want to give it up. So that makes me hesitant to think that I have a monopoly on virtue, or that I'm really willing to live the virtues when it costs something. That obviously, that's the hard thing to do. It's easy enough to maintain tranquility when you're lying on your couch and reading the Stoics during COVID, because we're not going outside, but to actually make sacrifices requires practicing the kind of courage and self-sacrifice that also is part of the virtue. So those are just some thoughts, but thank you very much for both of those. That's great.
Excuse me. Sorry. Just speak into the microphone.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. This was very inspiring. I wanted to ask you about demagoguery. I think we're in a time that people are concerned that it's coming closer. Can you give us maybe a little historical perspective and what danger we might be in now?
Yes, thank you for asking. It's extraordinary how central the main fear of the founders is the demagogues. And for Hamilton, it was a Caesar on horseback who, remember, Caesar, who's started off in the Republic, elected by the Senate, flatters the people and subverts the Republic and installs himself as a dictator for life. So he's initially elected. And Hamilton is afraid that a future Caesar will take advantage of civil commotion and overthrow democratic institutions. Hamilton's solution is a president for life, because they think if the president's elected for life, he won't be tempted to court cheap popularity and will serve the public interest. Jefferson also fears demagogues, but has the opposite prescription. And I found this amazing letter when Madison sends Jefferson the new Constitution for the first time. Jefferson says, I have two objections. First, there's no Bill of Rights. And second, the president is eligible for re-election. And I'm fearful that in the future, a president might lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states who voted for him to support him, and refuse to leave office. Literally from Thomas Jefferson absolutely. It's amazing. What's Jefferson's solution? 1-year term limit for the president. If the president can't run again, he's not going to cry fake votes and try to steal the election. So they have different prescriptions, but they're very concerned about demagogues. And they don't know whether the system will work. At the end of their lives, Adams and Jefferson and Washington are all worried, When is the future Caesar going to come? Will the Republic survive? What's their solution? What's going to save us? They don't know that we're going to make it. It's up to us not to elect those demagogues, not to elect the people who are going to flatter us most or try to, favor our faction rather than the other faction, but to think about the public good, the good of the whole, to elect virtuous leaders who themselves be restrained. Something we see, that virtue is not some civics thing or some kind of Sunday school touchy-feely. This is the future of the Republic. These virtues of moderation, public concern, self-sacrifice are central. The other thing is the past republics fell. Madison, when he comes to Philadelphia, reads a trunk full of books that Jefferson sent from Paris about the failed republics of Greece and Rome. There's never been an example of a republic that survived. Just a little classical political theory. All simple forms of government degenerate. Monarchy degenerates into tyranny, oligarchy, aristocracy into oligarchy, and democracy into the mob. And that's why they want a mixed government to prevent any one order from predominating. But they're really afraid that democracies are going to go the way of Greece and Rome. So, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. None of us does. Elections and empires can turn on a few votes or on some wars or on fevers. But what the wisdom tells us is it really is up to us. And not just to vote. Voting is important, but also just to practice this self-improvement, to study history. It's so important to study history. It's urgently important to study history. And John Quincy Adams has this amazing injunction on the Jubilee of the Constitution. He says, unless citizens study the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, the Republic will fall. And then he quotes Deuteronomy and says, whisper these principles to your children before they go to bed. Put them as frontlets between your eyes and make them the rock of your civic salvation. I mean, it's absolutely, could not be more powerful. And I do want to urge you to educate yourself about the Constitution and the Declaration and check out the amazing resources of the National Constitution Center, which are free. Our mission is to teach kids and adults about the Constitution. This incredible interactive Constitution, constitutioncenter.org, 70 million hits since we launched, among the most Googled Constitution in the world, has the leading liberal and conservative thinkers writing about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. Weekly podcast I have, We the People, where I talk to liberal and conservative thinkers about constitutional issues in history and in the news. And these great free Constitution 101 classes that are online, and we're also doing in partnership with Khan Academy. It's just a feast of free learning, and what I'm telling you is it's your duty to engage with this stuff. It's unless you do, then the Republic will fall. Maybe one more. Absolutely. Maybe that's a good way to end. Please do, check it all out, and thank you so much. Great to be here.